I want to be clear that I filed the report in good faith. That is not a defense. I know it isn't a defense. I have been a scout third in the Velhari Reconnaissance Directorate for 11 years, and I understand better than most that good faith is not the same as good work. But I want it on record in this supplementary account, which my supervising quorum assessor has requested in lieu of the formal censure that was, I am told, still on the table as recently as last week, that when I first observed Outpost Harrow 7, I was not being lazy or inattentive or contemptuous of the human species in any general sense. I had simply never encountered a human installation quite that quiet, and I interpreted the quiet the way anyone in my position would have interpreted it. I interpreted it as evidence that there was nothing there. I will now spend approximately as long as it takes to explain, in careful detail, exactly how wrong that was. Before I do, I should note that this supplementary account has been requested in a particular format, a first-person narrative, in plain language, covering the full operational timeline from initial survey approach through the conclusion of the formal review process. My quorum assessor specified plain language, with some emphasis, which I understand to mean that she has already read 11 pages of technical report and does not need another 11 pages of technical report. She wants the version that explains what happened and why and what I think about it now. I will provide that version. I find it somewhat more uncomfortable to write, which is probably the point. I will try not to be too uncomfortable about it. Harrow 7 sits at the edge of what the human navigational charts, which we had acquired by that point through standard intelligence procurement, meaning we had paid a somewhat dubious courier, an amount I will not specify, designate as the Cedral Reach. It is not a glamorous part of space. The Cedral Reach is a long, shallow arc of secondary systems strung between two modest clusters, valuable mainly because it offers a relatively clear transit lane between the human interior colonies and their outer logistics depots. The lane itself is unremarkable. The systems flanking it are unremarkable. Harrow 7 occupies a stable point near the fourth planet of a dim K-type star that the humans have assigned a catalog number rather than a name, which tells you something about how much they care about it. The outpost itself from the outside tells you roughly the same thing. I was running a standard observation pass with a 4-ship reconnaissance element. The Velhari Directorate classifies anything under 6 ships as an element rather than a wing, which is a bureaucratic distinction that has never made any operational difference but which my filing software enforces with considerable rigidity. 4 ships, my own vessel, the Avanrao, the Tethys 9, commanded by Scout 2nd Marath, the Survey Tender Corval, and a signals ship, the Paranome, which we had along because the Directorate had recently acquired a new suite of passive listening arrays and wanted field data on their performance in an operational environment. I will return to the Paranome. It will come to matter a good deal. We came out of transit at a comfortable distance from Harrow 7 and ran a full passive survey before doing anything else. This is standard protocol. You do not light up your active sensors until you know what you are looking at, because active sensor pings are detectable at ranges that would embarrass you, and the whole point of reconnaissance is to gather information without giving any. So we sat and we listened and we looked. What we found was not impressive. Harrow 7 was a modular installation. The human military uses several standard patterns for outposts of this class, and Harrow 7 matched what our intelligence files called the Type 6 waystation configuration. A central habitat ring, 2 docking spurs capable of handling a total of perhaps 8 vessels if everyone was cooperative about parking, an attached processing module that could handle fuel and basic supply functions, and a communications array that the file described as adequate for standard short-range coordination. The whole structure was roughly 400 meters across its widest dimension. For reference, the smallest dedicated warship in the Velhari fleet is 1,100 meters. The visual survey was consistent with a station that had seen better years. Several of the outer hull panels on the habitat ring showed the kind of thermal differential stress cracking that develops when a structure has been through too many heating and cooling cycles without proper maintenance. The thermal stress patterns were consistent with somewhere between 12 and 15 years of service without significant hull remediation, which put the station in the older tier of human infrastructure that I had cataloged in this region. One of the docking spurs had an access umbilical that was hanging at an angle, suggesting its magnetic clamp had partially failed at some point, and nobody had prioritized fixing it. The umbilical itself was retracted to a serviceable position, so the spur was still usable, but the angle was the angle of something that had been noted in a maintenance log and deprioritized in favor of more pressing concerns. The communications array, the one described as adequate for standard short-range coordination, had a secondary reflector dish that was physically rotated about 15 degrees away from its nominal alignment. 15 degrees is not a dramatic departure. In the context of the rest of the installation, it read as another item on the deferred maintenance list. The primary dish was correctly oriented. The secondary was not. On a better maintained station, someone would have corrected it. I noted all of this. I noted it carefully. I noted it in column 4 of my preliminary survey form, which is labeled Physical Condition Assessment, and I summarized it as outpost in marginal maintenance condition. Non-standard configuration of secondary comms array noted, likely deferred maintenance. No immediate military significance. I want to emphasize something. I did not dismiss Harrow 7. I assessed it accurately based on what I could see. The outpost looked like what it looked like. It looked like a tired waystation at the edge of an unremarkable transit lane, with thermal stress in the hull panels and a drooping docking umbilical and a crooked satellite dish. When something looks like a tired waystation at the edge of an unremarkable transit lane, the professionally defensible conclusion, the conclusion supported by the available evidence, is that you are looking at a tired waystation at the edge of an unremarkable transit lane. The professionally defensible conclusion in this case was not correct. I find it genuinely difficult to identify the specific moment at which I should have developed a different hypothesis, because the evidence genuinely supported my initial hypothesis at each step. The hull stress was real. The umbilical clamp had really failed. I did not know then, and do not know now, whether the maintenance neglect was intentional cover, or simply the genuine neglect that accumulates on any installation that is not a priority for its administrators. What I now understand is that the answer to that question did not matter for the purpose of my assessment. Whether the neglect was real or performed, it had the same effect. It read as an installation not worth a careful look. And I did not give it a careful look. I should tell you about the crew complement, because the crew complement was part of my reasoning, and I want my reasoning to be transparent. Our signals intercepts, passive, standard spectrum, nothing outside the Directorate's routine collection parameters, picked up internal communications consistent with a crew of between 9 and 14 individuals. Internal scheduling traffic, maintenance request logs, what appeared to be a regular weekly audio transmission that one of my analysts tentatively identified as a recreational broadcast of some kind, something in the register of the human entertainment formats that circulate via the relay network, though the encoding made it difficult to be certain. The human internal communications were not encrypted at any level that gave us particular difficulty, which I noted in my report as a minor security deficiency on their part, rather than as anything more interesting. In retrospect, I want to spend a moment on that observation, the lack of strong encryption on internal communications. I noted it as a deficiency. It is possible, I now consider it more than possible, that the unencrypted internal communications were not a deficiency at all. They were internal communications. They were the ordinary traffic of a small crew going about their day. If you want someone at the edge of your system to think your station is a bored logistics waystation, you do not encrypt your maintenance request logs. Encrypted maintenance request logs are interesting. Plaintext maintenance request logs are not. The unencrypted traffic was not a security gap. It was part of the presentation. But I did not think of it that way at the time. I filed it as a deficiency and moved on. 14 people, give or take, in a 400-meter waystation at the edge of an unimportant transit lane. We had 4 ships. 4 Velhari reconnaissance vessels carry a combined crew of well over 200, plus the sensor and analysis packages that make a proper fleet element feel like much more than its hull count suggests. 14 humans on a marginal waystation with a crooked dish and a broken umbilical did not register as a significant variable. It registered as a small crew doing modest work in a place that the people who assigned them there did not consider especially important. That characterization was, I now know, correct in at least one sense. The people who assigned them there almost certainly did not want the place to seem especially important. The people who assigned them there had presumably put considerable thought into making sure it did not seem especially important. In that narrow sense, my assessment and their intentions were perfectly aligned. Scoutsecond Marath, to his credit, asked whether we should run an active sweep. He asked this at the end of the first day's observation, during what we call an element brief, a review of the day's data before sleep cycle. The 4 ships would keep running passive collection overnight, but the command crews took a rest period, and the element brief was the last structured discussion before that rest. Marath raised the active sweep question with the careful phrasing of a junior officer making a suggestion he expects to be declined, but considers professionally obligated to offer. He said, "The secondary array configuration caught my attention, sir. An active sweep might tell us something more concrete about the station's actual sensor capabilities." He paused. It would give them a ping to notice, but if the station is what our initial assessment suggests it is, the ping wouldn't matter much. I considered this. I considered it for what I would now assess as an insufficient amount of time. Active sweeps leave traces. An active sweep of Harrow 7 would have told us things we did not need to know badly enough to announce our presence for. I had the passive data. I had the visual survey. I had the crew estimate. I had a solid picture of a small, undermanned, undermaintained waystation with no discernible military significance. I was going to spend 3 more days here and then file a report. An active ping would achieve nothing except possibly alerting 14 bored logistics technicians that someone was parked at the edge of their system. I declined the active sweep. I said we have what we need. The passive data is sufficient for a Class 2 assessment. We don't need to announce ourselves. Marath nodded. He was, as I said, a junior officer making a suggestion he expected to be declined. He did not press the point. I also declined Marath's second suggestion, offered in the same brief, which was that we ask the Paranome Signals team to run their new passive arrays in the direction of the outpost's communications equipment for an extended observation period. The standard baseline was 30 minutes. Marath suggested 6 hours. He said the crooked secondary dish had an orientation that he thought was worth a closer look, and that the new arrays on the Paranome were specifically designed for extended passive characterization of anomalous configurations. I said the crooked secondary dish was worth exactly the notation I had already put in column 4. He nodded again. He did not press that point either. I have since discussed these 2 exchanges with Marath at some length, under circumstances that I will describe as informal and that he has described, with what I felt was unnecessary precision, as an occasion on which I arranged for us to have dinner, and then proceeded to discuss nothing but Harrow 7 for approximately 2 hours while my food cooled on the table in front of me. He allowed this. He was patient about it. He did not say, "I told you so" at dinner any more than he had said it in the moment. which I think reflects well on him, and which I have been careful to acknowledge formally in this account. He was, as I have now formally acknowledged, entirely correct about both suggestions. The active sweep would have told us something, not by the data it collected, but by the response it provoked. A sudden change in the station's signals pattern, a shift in the secondary array's orientation, an increase in outbound transmission volume. Any of these would have been informative. A station doing what Harrow 7 was doing would have had to make some adjustment when confronted with an active sensor ping from 4 ships it had been hoping were running passive only. The adjustment might have been subtle, but Ovenreth's team on the Paranome would have caught it. The extended passive observation would have told us something even more directly. 6 hours of the Paranome's new arrays pointed at the secondary dish, rather than 30 minutes, would have caught the narrowband transmission bursts that Ovenreth eventually identified. She found them during the 4-day survey window, but it took until day 3.5. With 6 dedicated hours on day 1, she would have found them on day 1. Both of these things are true, and I declined both suggestions in the same brief, and I went asleep with the comfortable feeling of a survey officer who has made a sensible professional judgment. We ran our observation for 4 standard days. 4 days is the Directorate's minimum for a Class 2 transit lane survey, which Harrow 7 qualified as given the lane's modest strategic value. 4 days of passive observation, 4 days of traffic logging, what comes and goes, what volumes, what signatures, what schedules. Then you write your assessment and you move on to the next point in the survey rotation. I had completed perhaps 30 Class 2 surveys at this stage of my career. The format was not novel. The execution was not demanding. I find it useful now to be honest about that. I had done this many times, and the familiarity may have contributed to the ease with which I settled into a set of assumptions about what I was looking at. Day 1, Harrow 7 was quiet. The station's internal communications maintained their low, readable rhythm. Maintenance traffic, scheduling confirmations, the kind of procedural chatter that you expect from a small crew running a station that does not have enough going on to fill a full shift. My traffic analyst noted that the supply manifest references in the internal communications were consistent with basic consumables, food stores, atmospheric processing compounds, routine mechanical parts, and not with the kind of specialized cargo that would indicate a military logistics function of any particular note. I read her summary at end of shift and noted it without revision. Day 2, the light courier arrived. It came in on what appeared to be a standard approach corridor, docked at the functional spur, not the one with the broken umbilical, the other one, and transmitted a routine arrival sequence to Harrow 7 that our passive intercepts picked up without difficulty. The arrival sequence was unencrypted, which is common for small civilian couriers operating in low-security lanes. It stayed for 3 hours and 6 minutes, which my analyst noted was consistent with a mail and supply drop rather than a conference or extended logistics operation. It departed on the same corridor it had arrived on. Its drive signature on departure matched its arrival signature with no indication of anything loaded aboard that would change its mass distribution. Mail run. Routine. I noted it in column 7 and moved on. What I did not note, and what I did not ask my analyst to examine, was the content of what Harrow 7 transmitted to the courier during those 3 hours and 6 minutes. The outbound transmission log from the station during that window showed a modest volume spike consistent with data transfer, which I categorized as routine dispatch traffic. The station sending outbound mail via the courier, administrative correspondence, that kind of thing. This was a reasonable categorization. It was also, Ovenreth would later determine, where a portion of the collected surveillance data on my element went, compressed into a courier packet, and sent physically toward the interior network, rather than via the low-power burst transmissions Harrow 7 was using for its ongoing telemetry feed. They were using multiple channels. I was monitoring one of them and not thinking carefully about the others. Day 3, the first supply ship arrived. Larger than the courier, slower, sitting at the station for 22 hours. Its cargo manifest, derived from standard electromagnetic emissions during the docking and transfer process, was consistent with fuel compounds, extended consumables, and equipment parts in weight and volume categories that my analyst associated with atmospheric and power generation systems. Maintenance restocking. Nothing exotic. The supply ship's crew, based on thermal signature during docking, was roughly 8 individuals. They did not appear to leave the ship during the station's stay. The station's internal communication showed a modest uptick during the supply ship's presence that my analyst attributed to the coordination overhead of a docking and transfer operation. I read the Day 3 summary at end of shift, found it unremarkable, and made no revisions to my preliminary assessment. Day 4, first half. The second supply ship arrived, smaller than the first, in and out in 18 hours. Its cargo profile was similar. By this point, I was already working on what I expected to be the final traffic summary, a document that I was mentally framing as a clean, efficient Class 2 assessment of a station that was doing what it appeared to be doing in a location that was not worth worrying about. I was thinking about the next survey point, which was a Class 3 target and would require more preparation. I was, in the language I would later use when my quorum assessor asked me to characterize my mental state during the survey's final day, ready to move on. This is the context in which Ovenreth's first flag arrived. There is a version of this account in which I would tell you that there were subtle signs in the traffic picture, warning indicators that a more attentive observer would have caught, small details that would have told a better analyst that something was off. I want to be honest. The traffic picture was clean. The traffic picture gave me nothing. The supply ships were exactly what they appeared to be. The courier was exactly what it appeared to be. The lane traffic through the Cedral Reach was consistent with what the navigational charts described. If I had assigned a different analyst to traffic logging and given them the same data, I believe they would have reached the same conclusions I did. The traffic picture was not where the information was. The information was in the signals, and the signals were where I was not looking carefully enough. Let me explain what I mean when I say signals, as distinct from traffic, because the distinction is the crux of everything that followed. When I talk about traffic monitoring, I mean physical ships. What comes in, what goes out, what it looks like, what it is probably carrying, what its drive signature suggests about its origin and purpose. This is the bulk of what a transit lane survey does. You are building a picture of how the lane is actually used versus how it is described, and you are characterizing the military presence or absence that controls or patrols it. When I talk about signals monitoring, I mean the electromagnetic traffic that the station itself generates and receives, the communications it sends outward, the sensors it operates, the navigation aids it may maintain, the constant, low-level electronic hum of a station going about its day, which, if you listen to it carefully and long enough, tells you what the station is actually paying attention to. The paranome was assigned to my element specifically to collect signals data. Its new passive arrays were the whole point of including it on this survey rotation. The paranome senior analyst, a specialist first named Ovenreth, who had strong technical credentials, and whom I had previously found competent and pleasant if not especially assertive in communications with command, had been working her way through the array data for 3.5 days when she submitted a preliminary flag to my attention on day 4. I received the flag. I read the subject line. I assigned it a medium priority rating. I want to note, for the record, that medium priority is not the appropriate rating for a flag from the signals ship on an ongoing observation mission. The appropriate rating would have been high priority, which requires a response within 4 hours. Medium priority allows response within the same day cycle. I assigned medium priority because I had already formed a strong opinion about what Harrow 7 was, and a flag from the signals ship about what were presumably routine station emissions did not, in my judgment, require 4-hour turnaround when I was in the middle of the traffic summary that I had determined was the more significant deliverable. I read the flag at the end of the day cycle. The flag said, in Ovenreth's characteristically precise language, secondary array at Harrow 7, the one assessed as misaligned in column 4 of the preliminary survey, does not appear to be misaligned due to maintenance failure. Its current orientation is consistent with sustained directional monitoring of the transit approaches used by this reconnaissance element since our arrival in system. Request extended passive observation window to determine whether the array is actively conducting surveillance of this element. Note: the outpost signal's output appears low volume and highly dispersed in a format not flagged in current intelligence files, which would account for the apparent inactivity under short duration collection. I read this. I read it again. I wrote a response that said, "Noted, will incorporate into final assessment. Maintain current observation protocol." Then I went to sleep. I have thought about this response many times since. It is technically accurate, I did note it. I did intend to incorporate it. Maintaining the current observation protocol was an appropriate instruction. But it was the response of an officer who has read something that challenges his existing assessment and has decided, without quite deciding it explicitly, that his existing assessment is probably still right, and the flag is probably less significant than the specialist thinks it is. It is the response of a person reasoning backward from a conclusion rather than forward from evidence. And it is, as the events of Day 4 would demonstrate, completely wrong. In the morning of Day 4, 2 hours before my element was scheduled to break observation and transition to our next survey point, Ovenreth submitted a second flag. She marked it urgent. Urgent is a designation that requires a response within 1 hour. It is a designation that I had, in 11 years of service, used perhaps a dozen times personally, and never on a signals flag from a passive observation run of a Class 2 waystation. I read the second flag immediately. The second flag said, Harrow 7's outbound signals over the past 96 hours include a sustained, low-power, narrowband transmission stream on a frequency band not associated with standard waystation operations in current intelligence files. Extended analysis of the transmission structure is consistent with encoded telemetry rather than standard communications. The volume and formatting of the telemetry is consistent with systematic sensor data aggregation of the kind, produced by a passive surveillance array cataloging targets within sensor range. The orientation of the transmission stream matches a vector toward the human interior relay network. In summary, this installation appears to have been transmitting a detailed, continuous sensor log of this element's presence, composition, and movement since at least our arrival in system, and possibly before. The secondary array assessed as misaligned is a dedicated surveillance aperture. It has been pointed at this element continuously since we arrived. It is possible this is the array's normal operational orientation, and the personnel inside the station did not adjust it in response to our presence because they had no reason to adjust it. We arrived within its collection window. It collected us. I read this 3 times. I read it with the specific quality of attention that you bring to something you do not want to be true, and that is very clearly true. I put down my coffee, the Velhari equivalent of coffee, which I call coffee for simplicity, and I looked out the observation port at the distant, unremarkable light that was Harrow 7. At this distance, it was barely resolvable as a structure. It looked like a small geometric irregularity in the star field. It looked like something that barely warranted the observation window I was giving it. I thought with great care and total clarity that I had made a significant professional error. Then I called Ovenreth. Ovenreth answered with the composure of a specialist who has submitted 2 flags and received inadequate responses to both, and who has now been contacted directly by the person who gave her the inadequate responses. She did not say anything to indicate she thought my day 4 call was happening approximately 3 days later than it should have. She answered, as she had operated throughout the entire survey, with the patience of someone doing a job and getting on with it. I asked her to walk me through the full analysis. She did. She walked me through it carefully, in the methodical way that good analysts brief, starting with what the new passive arrays had collected and moving through her interpretation of the data layer by layer. The secondary array's orientation and what it implied, the narrowband transmission structure and why she had initially flagged it as anomalous. The longer she observed, the clearer the picture became. This was not routine station emissions. This was not a passive array that happened to be pointed vaguely in our direction. This was an active collection effort, running continuously, transmitting home in a format specifically designed to be uninteresting at first look. She said the format appeared to be a burst structure, short, dispersed transmissions sent at intervals that would blend into normal station background noise if you were not listening for them specifically. The Paranome's new arrays were good enough to aggregate the bursts and reconstruct the transmission stream. The older arrays the directorate had been fielding would not have caught it, or would not have caught it within a 4-day window. I asked what the transmission stream contained. She said, based on the volume and structure, we believe it is a reasonably complete technical characterization of this element. Drive signatures for all 4 ships. Power plant output profiles, sensor emission footprints, hull geometry derived from radar return modeling, estimated crew complements per vessel derived from thermal signature aggregation. I said crew complements. She said, approximate, yes. The thermal resolution on the surveillance array is sufficient to estimate occupancy levels per section with some accuracy over a 4-day observation window. They have a reasonably good picture of how many people are on each ship. I asked when the transmission had started. She said, at minimum at our arrival, possibly before the array was already active when we arrived. We cannot rule out that it was already running a collection pass on the transit lane before we entered the system, and that it simply absorbed us when we arrived. The transmission record shows no adjustment, no mode change, no spike in activity that would correspond to us being detected and the collection being initiated in response. It was running. We arrived. It kept running. I thanked her and ended the call. I then called Mareth. Mareth took the news with a composure that I found both professionally admirable and somewhat irritating, which is probably an unfair combination of reactions to have about someone who had given me 2 correct suggestions that I had declined. He listened to the summary without interrupting. He asked one clarifying question about the narrowband format, specifically whether Ovenreth had been able to determine whether the format was an improvised local solution or something standardized across the human signals apparatus. I said I didn't know yet and would ask. He nodded and said nothing further. He did not say I told you so. He did not need to. His expression did not change in any visible way that I could describe as satisfaction or vindication. He simply looked at me with the complete professional neutrality of a very competent subordinate, whose job does not include being right out loud at his commanding officer, and which neutrality contained, in its completeness, every version of I told you so he had ever chosen not to deliver. The neutrality held through the entire conversation. It held when I told him we were departing immediately, quietly, with no active pings or transmissions. It held when he acknowledged the instruction and began coordinating his ship's departure sequence. It held, I am told by mutual colleagues, for the rest of the transit, during which he said nothing about his own role in the preceding 4 days to anyone who did not directly ask. I told him we were leaving quietly. No active pings, no transmissions that would signal we had identified the station's purpose before we cleared the system. Anything we broadcast now, Harrow 7 was positioned to receive and transmit onward. We would collect what we could on the way out and sort it in transit. He said, "Understood, sir. Departure in 2 hours." I said, "Departure now." We left. The element transitioned without incident. Harrow 7 did not change its observable behavior as we departed. The secondary array tracked us out of the system, which Ovenreth confirmed in a transit update 2 hours after we cleared the transit threshold. She said the tracking was smooth and continuous, consistent with an automated system that maintained collection until the target was beyond effective range, at which point the array returned to its standard monitoring orientation. No human visible response, no change in transmission rate, no indication that the station's crew was doing anything differently because we were leaving than because we were arriving. They just watched us go. I found that, I will admit, more disquieting than the initial discovery. The discovery had been unpleasant in the way that professional errors are unpleasant. The sudden gap between what you believed and what was true, the uncomfortable arithmetic of what it cost. But the departure was something else. We left quietly, trying not to advertise that we knew what Harrow 7 was. Harrow 7 tracked us out of the system without changing anything about its operational posture, which meant one of two things. Either they did not know we had figured it out, or they did know and had no reason to behave differently because their job was to collect data and we were no longer within range. In either case, the net result was the same. We had come, they had collected us, and we had left, and the station went on with its work. When we cleared the transit threshold and could no longer be detected by anything aboard Harrow 7, I asked Ovenreth to give me a final assessment of what the station's data package likely contained. She said it was thorough. She said thorough, in a way that suggested she had considered several other words before settling on that one. I said I appreciated the precision. She said, "They know your ship better than your maintenance crew does, sir, in terms of external technical characterization. They have 4 days of continuous data at reasonably close range with sophisticated collection equipment. We would need a deliberate inspection sweep with active sensors to collect the same quality of data on them, and we chose not to do that." Yes, I said, we did. She did not comment further. She returned to her analysis. I went back to my command chair and sat there for another few minutes thinking about what kind of people sit in a cold waystation at the edge of nowhere and build that kind of picture of everything that comes within range, and whether they could possibly have known that I was also sitting in my chair thinking about them, and whether it would have mattered to them at all if they had. I spent the transit period writing the report. The report was difficult to write. My quorum assessor has since told me she has read a great many field reports in her career and found this one to be unusual in several respects, which I understand as a diplomatic way of saying she had never read a field report in which the surveying officer corrected his own preliminary assessment quite this thoroughly, or with quite this level of explicit self-documentation. She did not mean it as a compliment exactly, but she did not mean it as a criticism either. She told me she found the document instructive. I told her I found the process of writing it instructive. We agreed that the instruction had come at a meaningful professional cost, which was a polite way of agreeing that it would have been better if I had caught the problem on day one. The first draft of my preliminary assessment had been 4 pages. It characterized Harrow 7 as a marginally maintained, lightly staffed waystation of low strategic importance, warranting continued low-priority monitoring on standard cycles. It recommended no further dedicated reconnaissance resources. It noted the Type 6 configuration and the modest traffic picture. It said the crew was probably doing logistics support work. It said the crooked secondary dish probably had a failed drive actuator. It said the station was, in the plain language of its concluding paragraph, not worth a second look. I deleted the first draft. The second draft took me the better part of 20 hours. I wrote and rewrote sections of it more times than I typically revise anything, which is an observation that says something unflattering about both my writing process and my state of mind during that transit. Here is what the second draft said about Harrow 7 that the first draft did not. The secondary communications array, designated in column 4 of the preliminary survey as showing deferred maintenance, is a precision surveillance aperture in deliberate non-standard orientation. The misalignment is the correct alignment for monitoring the transit approaches to Harrow 7's observation zone. The array is not broken. It has never been broken. It was pointed where it was pointed intentionally. The interior configuration of the station, based on signals analysis of thermal and electromagnetic output, is not consistent with a standard Type 6 waystation optimized for supply and logistics functions. It is consistent with a Type 6 hull that has been internally reconfigured, whether originally or through subsequent modification, to prioritize signals collection and processing capacity over logistics throughput. The habitat ring, which a standard Type 6 uses primarily for crew quarters, common spaces, and storage, appears in this installation to house a significant quantity of equipment, generating thermal signatures inconsistent with quarters and consistent with data processing infrastructure. Signals analysis suggests more processing density per unit volume than any comparable waystation we have on file. The crew of 9 to 14 is not a logistics crew. It is, based on the station's actual function, almost certainly a signals analysis team. 14 people is a reasonable staffing level for a passive collection installation of this kind, sufficient for continuous multi-shift coverage of a surveillance aperture, sufficient for data processing and transmission work, insufficient for anything else of military significance. The station is a listening post. It is an extremely well-designed listening post, measured by the ratio of apparent significance to actual capability. It looks like nothing. It looks like a forgotten waystation at the edge of an unimportant lane with a skeleton crew, a drooping umbilical, and a crooked dish. This is the point. The entire physical presentation of Harrow 7 is calibrated, whether deliberately or incidentally, to read as negligible on a standard transit survey. The maintenance-stressed hull panels, the off-angle docking umbilical, the misaligned secondary array. These features collectively produce a picture that reads, at standard survey range and with standard survey attention, as a station not worth a careful look. It works. I am the evidence that it works. The crew has spent months cataloging every vessel that transits within range of their sensor aperture. They have done this quietly, continuously, and without transmitting anything that would attract notice under standard collection protocols. The outbound transmission format they use is not in our current intelligence files. This is a gap in our files, not a gap in their operations. The gap in our files allowed them to operate unseen for the full duration of my element's presence. In the 4 days my element was present in system, Harrow 7 compiled what specialist First Ovenreth assesses as a reasonably complete technical portrait of all 4 ships in this element. Drive signatures, power plant output curves, sensor emission profiles, hull geometry from radar modeling, crew complement estimates from thermal aggregation. My element spent 4 days watching them. They spent 4 days watching us back, and they began before we did. I find this last point difficult to write around, so I will write it plainly. When my element arrived at Harrow 7 was already running. They did not detect us and begin collecting. They were collecting and we entered their collection window. The distinction matters because it means there was no moment of decision on their part, no alert status, no mode change that we might have detected. They were doing their job. We arrived. Their job continued. We were part of what they were watching that day. In the same way the supply ships and the courier had been part of what they were watching, and they treated our presence with the same quiet professional attention they gave to everything else that came within range. The formal review took 3 weeks. My quorum assessor is a senior official whose name I will not include in this account without her permission, and who conducted the review with a thoroughness that I found, under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. She interviewed Marath. She interviewed Ovenreth. She reviewed the original preliminary assessment and the corrected 11-page report. She reviewed the command logs, which showed 12 minutes of uninterrupted chair occupancy following my call with Ovenreth, a period of inactivity that she described in her review notes as consistent with an officer processing a significant assessment revision, which I took as a charitable interpretation of what was, in fact, a scout third sitting in his command chair staring at a star and being embarrassed. She also reviewed the flag log. The flag log is the administrative record of every anomaly flag submitted and every response given during a mission. My response to Ovenreth's first flag, the noted will incorporate reply, appears in the log with its timestamp and priority assignment. My quorum assessor read it, I am told, without visible expression. She then read it again. She then noted, in the margin of her working copy, a single word that the administrative staff later transcribed into the review record. The word was, unfortunate. I appreciate the restraint. She asked me, in a formal interview that took most of an afternoon, to walk through my decision-making at each stage of the survey. I walked through it. I was honest about each point where a different decision would have produced a different outcome. Marath's suggestion about the active sweep, his suggestion about the extended passive observation window, the medium priority rating I assigned to Ovenreth's first flag, the fact that I had read the first flag at the end of the day cycle rather than within the hour. She listened without expression for most of this. She asked clarifying questions at several points, not challenging questions, not questions designed to expose something I had omitted, just the questions of someone who is building a thorough picture. At one point she asked whether, in my assessment, the survey outcome would have been different if the paranome had not been attached to the element. I said I didn't know. She said that was an honest answer. She did not follow up on it, and I understood that she was, at that moment, doing the arithmetic herself. Without the paranome's new arrays and Ovenreth's analysis, the narrowband transmission bursts would not have been detected at all. The element would have completed its survey, filed a 4-page preliminary assessment calling Harrow 7 an unremarkable waystation, and moved on. The directorate would have no record that the installation existed as a surveillance post. Whatever data Harrow 7 had collected on my element would have gone home uncontested and unknown. The new arrays paid for themselves on this single survey. I found this difficult to feel good about. She did not offer opinions during the interview. She said she would complete her review and provide findings within a week. The findings came in slightly under a week. The censure, when it came down, was calibrated. I had been prepared for something more severe, and I want to be honest about why. The professional error was genuine, and the consequences of it were real. Harrow 7 now had a detailed technical portrait of 4 Velhari reconnaissance vessels. That data was somewhere in the human relay network, being received by whatever analytical teams the humans maintain for this kind of intelligence. Those teams now knew things about 4 of our ships that we had not given them. They had earned the information. I had not taken adequate steps to prevent them from earning it. That is a concrete and non-trivial outcome. The mitigating factors, as my quorum assessor described them in her findings. I had filed a thorough and honest supplementary account. I had not attempted to minimize or obscure the error at any stage of the process. The revised strategic assessment of Harrow 7 that I produced was considered substantive, and, in the words of the senior analyst who reviewed it, useful to the directorate's current intelligence picture, in a way that the original 4-page assessment conspicuously was not. I had, through the very thoroughness of my corrective documentation, identified a category of installation that the directorate had no previous file on. The gap in the intelligence files regarding Haro 7's transmission format was being corrected. The recommendation I made regarding Haro 7 as potentially non-unique had been forwarded to the relevant analytical sections, and I am told, received serious attention. I was reassigned from Independent Element Command to a mentorship role for the remainder of my current service rotation. This is not a demotion in any formal sense. I remain a Scout Third. I retain my rank and seniority. I am responsible for the professional development of junior scouts in the Directorate's training cohort, which is work I take seriously and intend to do well. The juniors I am responsible for will hear, at some point during our working relationship, the complete account of Haro 7. I consider this the most useful thing I can do with the experience. Marath received the element command. He has been, by all accounts I have received, thorough and attentive and notably receptive to suggestions from his specialists and junior officers. I am told that on his first independent survey, he ran an extended passive observation on a signals anomaly flagged by his Paring-class vessel on day 1, and gave the specialist a formal commendation for the flag. I heard this from a colleague and felt two things simultaneously, which were pride in Marath and something adjacent to what I believe humans call irony. Ovenreth received a formal commendation. The commendation specifically credited her persistence in flagging the Haro 7 anomaly and the quality of the analysis she produced under conditions of inadequate support from her commanding officer, which is language that my quorum assessor included deliberately and accurately. She deserved every word of it. She had done her job well, and she had done it correctly, and she had delivered her findings twice against inadequate response and continued working productively regardless. If you are looking for the person in this account who was right and acted well on being right, she is the person. I have told her this directly. In one of the informal conversations my quorum assessor did not request, but which I felt were the right thing to do. The Paranome's new passive arrays received a favorable operational assessment. This produced, in my internal experience, a particular kind of irony. The instrument I brought along specifically to collect passive signal data, operated by the specialist who correctly identified the anomaly I failed to adequately investigate, has been positively reviewed partly on the strength of data collected during a mission I mishandled. The review board cited the Haro 7 survey as evidence that the new arrays were capable of detecting non-standard transmission formats that legacy equipment would have missed entirely. This is accurate. The assessment is deserved. I simply cannot read it without thinking about what we could have done with those arrays if I had used them the way Marath suggested on day 1. I have been asked, as the final section of this supplementary account, to provide operational recommendations arising from my experience at Haro 7. I will be direct about these. They are not hypothetical. They are corrections to specific failures in the survey that I have documented above. Some of them will require protocol changes that go beyond what a Scout Third would ordinarily propose. I make them anyway because the quorum assessor's mandate for this supplementary account specifically requested operational takeaways, and producing vague or cautious recommendations in that context would be both unhelpful and somewhat cowardly. First, transit lane surveys should include mandatory extended passive observation of any installation whose physical configuration departs from standard maintenance expectations in either direction. A station that looks neglected may be neglected, or it may have decided to look neglected. The departure from standard expectation, too much maintenance or too little, is the signal that more attention is warranted. The standard passive observation baseline for a Class 2 survey is insufficient to characterize low-volume, dispersed transmission formats under any reasonable definition of characterize. 6 hours of dedicated signals collection on day 1 of the Haro 7 survey would have produced what 4 days of inadequate attention barely produced in time to be useful. The baseline should be revised upward for any installation showing physical anomalies in column 4. Second, anomaly flags from signals specialists should be reviewed within the same duty cycle in which they are submitted, assigned a response priority of at least high regardless of the surveying officer's existing confidence level, and acknowledged substantively and in person rather than through a written reply. The word noted is not a substantive acknowledgement. It is a way of filing something you are not ready to revise your assessment around. If a specialist has done enough work to submit a formal anomaly flag, that specialist has done enough work to warrant a direct conversation about what they found. My response to Ovenreth's first flag was the worst kind of professional response, technically compliant and operationally useless. The protocol should not allow that. Third, the current intelligence file should be updated to include the narrowband transmission format identified at HARO 7 and treated as a priority scan target in all future signals collection. The format was specifically designed to be uninteresting under standard collection protocols. It will look uninteresting in other contexts and other surveys. Every analyst running passive signals collection should know what to look for. The format should be in the standard scan library, not a footnote in a supplementary account that most analysts will never read. Fourth, the directorate should treat HARO 7 not as an anomaly but as an example of a type. The design philosophy it represents, appear negligible, collect comprehensively, transmit quietly, is coherent and deliberate. It was not improvised. Someone designed the transmission format. Someone decided what hull configuration would read as lowest priority on a standard survey. Someone worked out the coverage angle that would allow a secondary array to monitor transit approaches while appearing to be a misaligned maintenance item. These are not decisions made by a single station's crew on their own initiative. They are decisions made by people with a clear operational philosophy and enough confidence in that philosophy to build a station around it and put it in a lane that sees routine traffic. There are more of these. We do not know how many or where or how long they have been running because we have not known to look for them. We know now. I recommend treating the search as sustained and systematic. Fifth, and this is the recommendation I find most difficult to frame correctly, because it is less a procedural change than a posture change. The directorate should develop a working assumption that human installations in secondary lanes may be engaged in active-passive collection, even when there is no visible evidence that they are. This is a reversal of the current default assumption, which is that a station is doing what it appears to be doing unless evidence suggests otherwise. HARO 7 demonstrates that the threshold for evidence suggesting otherwise was too high and too dependent on visual indicators. The correct assumption, going forward, is that any human installation with a signal's aperture, correctly aligned, misaligned, or apparently broken, is potentially collecting, and that the absence of obvious indicators is not evidence to the contrary. This will make survey work more cautious and more time-consuming. I recognize that. I am recommending it anyway. The supplementary account ends here, per the format requirements. I will add one final observation that is not a formal recommendation, but that I cannot, in good conscience, omit, because my quorum assessor asked for plain language, and this is what plain language requires. In the 4 days my element spent observing HARO 7, none of the crew aboard that station 9 or 14, or however many there actually were, did anything that required my attention. They went about their shifts. They filed their maintenance requests. They broadcast their weekly program on schedule. They pointed their secondary array at my ships with the steady, unhurried attention of people who had all the time they needed and saw no reason to approach the job any differently. 2 supply ships came and went. A courier came and went. The lane operated around them as it had been operating before we arrived. Nothing changed. The outpost did not change its posture for 4 consecutive days, while a 4-ship alien reconnaissance element sat within sensor range. I did not know then what I know now about what was happening inside those 400 meters, but I know it now. A small crew in an unremarkable station in an unimportant part of space was doing work they had clearly been doing for a long time, with the patient efficiency of people who understood what they were there for and were getting on with it. They were not rattled by our arrival. They were not performing calm in the face of something alarming. They were simply calm, because the work was the work and they were doing the work, and a four-ship reconnaissance element appearing at the edge of their system was not an emergency. It was a data collection opportunity. They took it. I have thought about what kind of people do that. I have thought about the particular quality of patience and steadiness required to sit in a battered, cold-looking waystation at the edge of nowhere and conduct careful, sustained, professional work without any visible urgency or drama. To point your instruments at what needs to be pointed at. To send your data home in quiet bursts that no one will notice. To watch everything that comes within range and log it and keep going. To do this for months, possibly years, in a place that was deliberately designed to look like nowhere worth being. There is a particular kind of person who thrives in that assignment and a particular kind of person who does not. The ones who thrive are the ones for whom the work itself is the point, not the visibility of the work, not the recognition, not the drama of operating in a high-profile location. They go to their stations, they run their arrays, they do the technical work of cataloging whatever comes within range, and they send the results home, and they do it again the next day. They do not need Haro 7 to seem important. They know what it does. That is sufficient. 14 people, by my estimate, had been doing this for months before I arrived. Whatever I thought about the station when I was looking at it from the outside, tired, neglected, low priority, not worth a careful look, they had been inside it building a picture of the Cedral Reach that my 4 ships combined did not have the patience to assemble. They had it because they had been there. They had been there quietly, consistently, for long enough that the lane's traffic patterns were probably familiar to them in a way that a 4-day survey visit never produces. The best word I have found for it, after 11 years of looking at installations from the outside and trying to understand what they are from what they show me, is unhurried. They were unhurried. They were not performing patience. They simply had it. And because they had it, they worked at the pace the work required, which was the pace of 4 days of continuous passive collection with no indication that anything unusual was happening, while something unusual was happening 20,000 meters away and edging closer to a conclusion they had already reached about us. They knew we were there. They knew from the moment we arrived. They were not in a hurry about it. I find this more instructive than the tactical errors that produced the censure. The tactical errors were failures of process. Process can be improved. What I described in the previous paragraphs is not something that better protocol corrects for. It is a quality of the people. You cannot legislate patience into a station's crew. You can only account for the possibility that it is there, in the next quiet way station at the edge of the next unimportant lane, pointed in a direction that looks wrong and isn't, watching everything and sending it home. The next time you find yourself looking at a battered station that doesn't seem worth careful attention, I recommend the careful attention. It already knows you're there. It has known since you arrived. It is not in a hurry.